15,000 feet over the outskirts of Berlin, 2 American fighters were all that was left of their formation. Everyone else had gone home. Mechanical trouble, aborts, drop tanks that would not feed. The ordinary attrition of a deep penetration mission had peeled the rest of the squadron away one at a time until only 2 silver Mustangs held the sky above the German capital. It was the 8th of March, 1944. Below them lay the ball-bearing works at Erkner, the target the heavy bombers had flown almost 600 miles to reach. And rising toward those bombers, in numbers that made a mockery of 2 lone fighters, came the Luftwaffe. By every rule of arithmetic a fighter pilot is taught, the 2 Americans should have turned for England and let the bombers fend for themselves. Nobody would have blamed them. 2 against the defense of Berlin is not a fight. It is a statistic waiting to be written down. They did the opposite. One of them keyed his radio and asked the other if he was still there. The other said he was. And then the 2 of them rolled in on a formation of Messerschmitt 109s that outnumbered them many times over, and in the space of a few violent minutes, they claimed 6 enemy fighters between them, and both came home alive. The 2 men were named Don Gentile and John Godfrey. Within weeks, one of them would be on the cover of the newspapers, shaking hands with the Supreme Allied Commander, being called a one-man Air Force, sent home across the Atlantic to sell war bonds as the most famous fighter pilot in the American sky. The other would still be at the airfield, still flying, still killing German aircraft in numbers that would eventually pass his partners, and almost nobody outside the squadron would ever learn his name. And here is the part that should stop you. The man who got the glory got it, in large part. For missions, the other man flew on his wing, guarding his tail, taking the shots he did not take, so that the record could belong to one name instead of 2. The famous Ace and the forgotten Wingman were not rivals, they were a team. The system just decided very early which one of them the story was going to be about. This is the story of that decision. The story of 2 young men from opposite corners of the map, who flew the finest fighter of the war together, who covered each other over Germany, and who were pulled apart, not by the enemy, but by their own side's hunger for a hero. One of them got the headlines. The other got shot down covering a man who could not see he was there. And by the end, the irony of how each of them fell will tell you almost everything about how the air war really worked. Let me take you back to where both of them started, because they could not have started further apart. Start with the one who became the legend. Dominic Salvatore Gentile was born in Piqua, Ohio, in December of 1920, the son of Italian immigrants who had come over in 1907. Everyone called him Don. He was airplane crazy from boyhood, in the way a certain kind of American boy was in the 1930s, when flight was still new enough to be magic and cheap enough, barely, for a working family to touch. His father did something remarkable for a man of modest means. He bought his son an airplane, a little open cockpit sport biplane, for something in the neighborhood of $450. By the middle of 1941, before the United States was even in the war, Don Gentile had logged more than 300 hours in the air. He was, by any measure, a gifted natural pilot. The United States Army Air Corps did not want him. He lacked the 2 years of college the peacetime Air Corps demanded of its flying cadets, and it turned him away. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the first quiet piece of the pattern. The service that would later parade Gentile as its finest could not, in 1941, find a place for a 20-year-old with 300 hours who wanted nothing on earth but to fly and fight. So he went north, the way a number of determined young Americans did, and he joined the Royal Canadian Air Force. He earned his wings in November of 1941 and shipped to Britain. In England, he was posted to one of the Eagle squadrons, the units made up of American volunteers flying for the Royal Air Force before their own country entered the war. Gentile went to the Eagle Squadron, numbered 133, and he flew the Supermarine Spitfire Mark V, and he was good at it immediately. Over the disastrous Dieppe raid, on the 19th of August, 1942, he shot down a Junkers 88 and a Focke-Wulf 190 in a single day. 2 victories, in a Spitfire, before he had ever worn an American uniform in combat. When the 3 Eagle squadrons were handed over to the United States Army Air Forces in September of 1942, they became the 3 fighter squadrons of a new outfit, the 4th Fighter Group, based at an airfield in Essex called Debden, Station 356. Gentile put on American wings, took a commission as a 2nd lieutenant, and kept flying. The group traded its beloved Spitfires for the enormous P-47 Thunderbolt, a 7-ton monster the ex-Spitfire men initially hated for its size and its sink rate in a climb. Gentile learned it, scored in it, and by the fall of 1943 was a flight leader and a captain, respected inside the squadron, still unknown outside it. To understand Gentile, you have to understand the man who commanded him, because the 4th Fighter Group was built in one officer's image. Colonel Don Blakesley was a Cleveland man who had also come up through the Royal Air Force, and he was, by common consent, the finest fighter leader the 8th Air Force produced. He did not have a spectacular personal score, and he did not care. What he had was an almost fanatical devotion to being in the air. Grover Hall records that Blakesley flew a staggering number of combat hours, well over 1,000 by some accounts, far past the point where any medical officer would have grounded him, and that he hid and juggled his flight time to keep flying when the rules said he should stop. He led from the front. He expected his pilots to be aggressive to the point of recklessness, and he had no patience for anyone who treated flying as anything less than total war. That was the culture Gentile and Godfrey came up in, a group where a man was measured by how hard he went at the enemy, and where the commander himself would not leave the cockpit. It made them superb. It also made them hungry for the score in a way the publicity men would later find very easy to use. Roger Freeman, whose work on the 8th Air Force and the Mighty 8th remains the backbone of what we know about these operations, describes a 4th Fighter Group in this period that was proud, aggressive, and a little bit chaotic. A unit full of individualists still learning to fight the American way after learning to fight the British way first. That is, the Don Gentile the war had produced by late 1943. Skilled, ambitious, hungry for the enemy, and completely anonymous to the folks back home. If you have found this worth your time so far, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people, and it is the single most useful thing you can do for a channel like this one. Now, back to Debden, and to the second man in this story, who was arriving at that same airfield just as Gentile was becoming a leader in it. His name was John Trevor Godfrey, and where Gentile carried ambition, Godfrey carried grief. Godfrey was born in Montreal in March of 1922, to British parents, and raised in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. He was, by the ordinary measures, a promising boy, class president of his high school, restless, a little wild. And then the war reached across the ocean and took the person he loved most. His older brother Reggie had gone over as a civilian volunteer, a member of a technical corps sailing to Britain to help build up the island's radar defenses. The ship carrying him, the Vancouver Island, was torpedoed and sunk with the loss of everyone aboard. Reggie Godfrey was gone, somewhere in the cold North Atlantic, and his younger brother John never got over it. Most people, losing a brother to the war, would want the war to end. Godfrey wanted in. He tried to run off and enlist in Canada, and his mother called the authorities and had him brought back more than once before his parents finally let him go. He joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in the autumn of 1941, and when he got his own fighter, he painted a name on the side of it that told you exactly why he was there. He called it Reggie's Reply. Every German aircraft he shot down was a letter addressed to the men who had put his brother in the sea. There was a boyishness to Godfrey that never quite left him, even in combat. He had a dog he loved, a mutt named Lucky, and he had the animal painted onto the side of his early aircraft inside a horseshoe, a talisman riding to war with him. He was not the cold, calculating killer of the fighter pilot myth. By his own account in his memoir, he was frightened much of the time, sickened by some of what he did, and driven forward anyway by the memory of his brother and by a loyalty to the men beside him that ran deeper than fear. That combination, a frightened man who kept going, is in some ways braver than the fearless killer the posters wanted, and it is one reason his book, The Look of Eagles, has outlasted almost every other fighter memoir of the war. He told the truth about the cost. He did not pretend it was easy or clean, and he flew again and again into the same sky that had swallowed his brother's ship, as if by killing enough of the enemy, he could somehow reach back across the water and settle the account. Godfrey transferred to the American service and arrived at Debden in the 336th Fighter Squadron in September of 1943. He flew his very first combat mission on the 27th of September 1943, and he flew it as the wingman of a rising flight leader named Don Gentile. That is where the partnership begins. On the first day, the veteran and the newcomer, the ambitious one and the grieving one, joined at the wingtip. Godfrey scored his own first victory, a Messerschmitt 109, on the 1st of December, 1943. Now, here's the thing the legend gets wrong, and it matters, because this audience does not tolerate a story built on a myth. The popular version says these two were inseparable, that Godfrey flew as Gentile's permanent wingman through the whole great run of victories. The 4th Fighter Group's own historians, working from the records and from what the surviving men actually said, tell it differently. Godfrey himself reckoned he had flown as Gentile's wingman for no more than around 10 of his partner's kills. Much of the time they were not paired at all. They were thrown together when the shifting arithmetic of a mission, the aborts and the losses, left them side by side. The 8th of March over Berlin, the day I opened with, was exactly that kind of accident. They were the only two of their squadron left in place, so they fought together, and they fought brilliantly. And the newsmen turned an accident of attrition into a legend of brotherhood. I think that distinction is the whole story in miniature. The truth was, two skilled pilots who sometimes flew together and covered each other superbly when they did. The legend needed something cleaner, a duo, a pair of inseparable brothers of the air, one of them a star. And the legend, as legends do, won. Here is the mechanism the legend was hiding, and it is worth understanding in detail because it is the key to everything that follows. A fighter formation in the Second World War was not a crowd of individuals hunting alone. It was built up from a single basic unit, a pair, a leader, and his wingman. The Germans had worked this out first in the Spanish Civil War, where a pilot named Werner Mulders refined the loose pair and the group of four that grew from it. The formation the Americans came to call the Finger Four, because the four aircraft sat in the sky spaced like the fingertips of an outstretched hand. Everyone copied it because it worked. Within the pair, the leader was the hunter. His eyes were forward, on the enemy he was trying to kill. The wingman was the shield. His eyes were everywhere else, on the sky behind and above and below, the sky the leader could not watch because he was busy shooting. When an enemy fighter tried to slide in behind the leader for an easy kill, the wingman's job was to see it coming, call it out on the radio, and either drive it off or die trying. A leader without a good wingman was a dead man who did not know it yet. A wingman who abandoned his leader to go chase a kill of his own was the worst thing a fighter pilot could be. The whole system ran on a simple, brutal bargain. You watch my back, I watch yours, and we both go home, or neither of us does. Now hold that bargain in your mind and look again at what an ace's score really is. Every one of those little painted crosses on the side of Gentile's Mustang was a kill he made, while someone, very often Godfrey, was flying behind him watching the sky he could not see. The kill goes in one man's logbook. The survival that made the kill possible was a shared act. This is not me being sentimental. This is the actual doctrine of air combat, written in the tactics manuals and paid for in blood, and it is precisely the thing the publicity machine could not fit onto a poster. A poster needs a hunter. It has no room for the shield. So let me give you the real machine underneath the myth, because the how of it is more impressive than the fairy tale. The thing that transformed both of these men from competent squadron pilots into names in the record books was not courage. They already had that. It was an airplane. In the last week of February 1944, the 4th Fighter Group converted from the P-47 Thunderbolt to the North American P-51B Mustang. And I want to be precise here, because the wrong Mustang is exactly the kind of error that gets a channel like this one dismissed. These men made their famous kills in the P-51B, the early Mustang with the framed razorback canopy, the one you looked out of through a bird cage of metal, not the bubble-topped P-51D that most people picture when they hear the word Mustang. The bubble top came later. In March and April of 1944, over Germany, it was the Razorback B, and if you see a bubble canopy Mustang in a painting of Gentile's Berlin fight, someone got it wrong. The conversion itself is one of the great small stories of the air war. Grover Hall, who served with the group and wrote its definitive history, 1,000 Destroyed, records that the group's commander, Colonel Don Blakesley, wanted the Mustang so badly and understood so completely what their range would mean that he promised his superiors the 4th would be operational on the new type in 24 hours. 24 hours on an unfamiliar fighter in the middle of a war. When his pilots protested that they barely knew the airplane, Blakesley's answer, as Hall tells it, was that they would learn to fly them on the way to the target. And that is very nearly what they did. The reason a driven man like Blakesley would take that risk comes down to one number, and it is the most important number in the entire European air war: range. The Thunderbolt, even with drop tanks, ran out of legs somewhere over the German frontier and had to turn back, leaving the bombers to go on alone into the worst of the fighter defenses. The Mustang could go the whole way. With drop tanks, it could escort the heavies to Berlin and back, well over 1,000 miles round trip, and still have fuel to fight when it got there. The bomber crews had been dying by the hundreds precisely because their little friends could not follow them deep. The Mustang closed that gap, and the men who flew it into the newly opened sky over Germany in that narrow window of early 1944, when the Luftwaffe still came up in strength and had not yet been bled white, had a target-rich field in front of them unlike anything before or after. And that window did not open by accident. In the third week of February 1944, the Army Air Forces launched a deliberate, coordinated campaign that the men called Big Week, and that the planners called Operation Argument. The idea was cold and clever. Send the heavy bombers deep into Germany against the aircraft factories, knowing the Luftwaffe would have to rise to defend them, and this time send the long-ranging Mustangs with them, not merely to shield the bombers, but to use the bombers as bait and destroy the German fighter arm in the air. For the first time, the escorts were being turned loose to hunt. The bomber crews paid a fearful price to play the lure, hundreds of them, but the strategy worked. The Luftwaffe came up, and over those late February and March days it was ground down at a rate it could not sustain, losing experienced pilots faster than its schools could replace them. That is the true meaning of the target Rich Sky, Gentile, and Godfrey flew into. It was not luck. It was the product of a strategic decision to force a killing battle in the air before the invasion of France, and the fighter pilots of the 4th Fighter Group were the instrument of it. When you hear that Gentile destroyed 15.5 aircraft in 5 weeks, understand that he did it in the single most concentrated fighter-killing period of the entire war in Europe, a window that existed because thousands of other men, in the bombers below him, were being offered up to open it. I think that context is essential, and the celebration of the lone ace almost always erases it. The aces scored the way they did in the spring of 1944 because a whole strategy, and a great many bomber crews, had set the table for them. That is the setting for the great run. Now watch the two of them go to work in it. Between the 3rd of March and the 8th of April, 1944, a span of just over 5 weeks, Don Gentile destroyed roughly 15.5 aircraft. His first Mustang kill was at Dornier 217 near Wittenberg on the 3rd of March. There was the 6 victory shared afternoon over Berlin on the 8th of March, the day that earned him the Distinguished Service Cross. On the 29th of March, he claimed 3 in a single mission. On the 8th of April, 3 more. In 5 weeks, he had gone from an unknown flight leader to the leading American ace in the European theater, and the newspapers, starved for a fighter hero to set against the bomber crew's grim story, found him. Let me give you one of those days at close range, because the numbers can go by too smoothly. On the 3rd of April, 1944, Gentile was down low near a German airfield when a Focke-Wulf 190 got onto his tail, exactly the situation the Wingman system exists to prevent. And for a few seconds, Gentile was the hunted rather than the hunter, jinking between the trees and the buildings with an experienced German pilot firing at him. His radio call in that moment became famous inside the group, a very human cry. "Help, I'm being clobbered down here by the railroad tracks." It is not the line of a fearless knight. It is the sound of a young man who thinks he's about to die and wants someone, anyone, to come and get the airplane off his back. Someone did. That is the point. Gentile was one of the finest fighter pilots America produced, and even he, on a bad afternoon, was 30 seconds from death and calling for help on the radio, and he lived because he was not actually alone up there, whatever the newspapers would later imply. He was flying at the absolute peak of the sport, right at the edge of what a man and a machine could do, day after day, and the strain of it showed. By the time his tour ended, he was worn thin, running on nerve and reputation, which is part of why what happened over the field on the 13th of April happened at all. A tired man, a low pass, a crowd of cameras, and the same appetite for the audience that had carried him all the way up. And here I have to slow down and be honest about the numbers, because the numbers are where this story has been lied about for 80 years, and this audience knows it. You will read that Don Gentile shot down 30 enemy aircraft. You will read that he broke Eddie Rickenbacker's First World War record of 26. Both of those statements are, at best, misleading. The official tally, the one recorded in United States Air Force Historical Study number 85, and confirmed in Frank Olenik's careful compilations of aerial victory credits, credits Gentile with 19.83 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air during his American service. Add the 2 he got flying the Spitfire for the Royal Air Force at Dieppe, and you reach about 21.83 aerial victories. To that you add roughly 6 aircraft he destroyed on the ground, strafing German airfields. Now you see where the 30 comes from. The 8th Air Force, in this period, counted aircraft destroyed on the ground toward a pilot's score, right alongside the ones he shot down in the air. Blend the air and the ground together, round the fractions up, add the wartime claims that later got trimmed by the credit boards, and you can push Gentile to 30. But an airplane burned on the ground by a strafing pass and an enemy fighter beaten in a turning fight at 20,000 feet are not the same achievement, and every pilot in that squadron knew it. Even at the time, some people saw the con. Time magazine, reporting on the competition for the title of American Ace of Aces, noted dryly that an eager 8th Air Force public relations officer had claimed the top spot for Gentile by counting 7 grounded aircraft in his total, and that this was why there were no protests from England when Douglas MacArthur announced that his man Richard Bong was the real leading American ace out in the Pacific. Time even reported that Gentile himself was embarrassed by the way his own command had inflated him into the top man. Think about that. The hero was uncomfortable with the size of his own legend, and the machine built it anyway. I believe that is the single most important thing to understand about Don Gentile, and it is not a criticism of him. He was a superb fighter pilot. 19.83 aerial victories is an extraordinary record, one of the very best in the theater, earned honestly at enormous risk. He did not need the padding. The padding was done to him, and for the machine's own purposes, not his. Because while the machine was busy making Gentile into a one-man air force, there was a second man on those same missions. And his numbers tell you what the Wingman system was actually for. John Godfrey ended the war credited with 16.33 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air. On the ground, the strafing tally, the sources split, and I am going to give you the split rather than pretend it is settled. Because pretending is how you lose this audience. Some reputable references credit Godfrey with 13.67 aircraft destroyed on the ground. Others, including the Imperial War Museum's American Air Record, put the ground figure at 12.66. The difference is 1 aircraft, an honest disagreement between careful people over 80-year-old strafing claims, and you should know it exists rather than hear a single confident number that hides the doubt. Either way, combine Godfrey's air and ground totals and you land around 30 destroyed, which is to say John Godfrey destroyed as many German aircraft as his famous partner, and by some counts more. And here is where the arithmetic becomes an accusation. During that dazzling 5-week run in the spring of 1944, on a good number of the missions where Gentile ran up his score, John Godfrey was flying his wing. That is what a wingman does. He does not go for the kill. He flies slightly back and to the side. He watches the sky behind his leader, and when an enemy slides in on the leader's tail, the wingman's job is to call it, to cover it, to take the shot that protects the man in front so the man in front can keep shooting. Every victory a great ace scores while his wingman guards his tail is, in a real sense, a shared victory. The record book only has room for one name. I want to name the pattern plainly, because it is the reason this channel exists. This is not a story about one man being better than another. Gentile and Godfrey were, as near as makes no difference, equals in the air. This is a story about a system that needed a single face for its poster, chose the more quotable and more photogenic of 2 equals, inflated his numbers with ground kills, and then sent him home a superstar, while the equal who had guarded his tail stayed behind to keep fighting in relative silence. The 4th Fighter Group's own association, looking back, put it about as bluntly as an official body ever does. Because of the ace race publicity of early 1944, they note, Godfrey never enjoyed the recognition given to Gentile, despite finishing as one of the group's top scoring pilots of the entire war. And if you have ever watched the person who actually does the work get passed over, while the one who manages the room and looks good in the photograph gets the promotion, you already understand the air war better than the men who wrote the press releases did. The pattern is older than any of us. It usually just does not come with a body count. Now let me take you to the collision point, the day the whole arrangement came to a head, because it is almost too neat to be true, and yet the records say it happened. Return to the 8th of March, 1944, over Berlin, the scene I opened with. The bombers were pressing on toward the Erkner ball-bearing works. Gentile and Godfrey, the last 2 of their squadron still in position, found themselves alone above a rising tide of German fighters. What happened next is the founding moment of the legend, and unlike much of what got printed later, this part is real. The 2 of them waded into a formation of Messerschmitt 109s and claimed 6 between them, and they did it by working exactly the way a fighter pair is supposed to work and almost never gets to. One would engage, the other would cover. When a 109 latched onto Gentile, Godfrey would call it and drive it off, or take it himself. When Godfrey committed, Gentile watched his back. They talked each other through it on the radio in a running patter that a war correspondent listening to gun camera film later turned into the most famous exchange of the American Air War. Are you still with me, Johnny? Still with you. You take the one on the right, I will take the one on the left, and we will have him between us. It was a genuine feat of airmanship and nerve, 2 men holding the sky over the enemy capital by trusting each other completely. Gentile got the Distinguished Service Cross for it. And here is the small, telling detail that captures the entire machine in a single image. When the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, came to Debden and pinned that decoration on Gentile and called him in a line that would follow Gentile the rest of his life and become the title of his own book, A One-Man Air Force, the newsreels needed a good shot of it. So the presentation was staged again for the cameras. The general had already decorated the man. For the newsreel, they did it a second time, for the lens. I do not know a better summary of the difference between the two men's war than that. Gentile's greatest day was a day he shared, wingtip to wingtip, with John Godfrey. The honor for it was pinned on one chest and then restaged for the cameras so the whole country could watch it pinned on that one chest again. Godfrey was there for the fight. He was not in the photograph. That word photograph is about to become the hinge of Don Gentile's entire life, because his combat career was ended, not by the Luftwaffe, but by a camera. By the middle of April 1944, Gentile had finished his combat tour. He was the leading American ace in Europe, the toast of the newspapers, and he was scheduled to go home for a war bond tour, to turn his fame into cash for the war effort. On the 13th of April 1944, returning from what was to be one of his last flights, he found the press assembled at Debden, reporters and movie cameras waiting to film the great ace. And Gentile, 23 years old and the most famous pilot in the sky, could not resist giving them a show. He brought his Mustang, the airplane he had named Shangri-La, down low over the field for the cameras, a high-speed pass to thrill the newsmen. He misjudged his height. The Mustang struck the ground and was wrecked. Gentile climbed out unhurt and humiliated. Now, the group's commander, Don Blakesley, had a standing order, recorded by the historians of the 4th, that any pilot who wrecked an airplane showing off was to be thrown out of the group, and Blakesley grounded him on the spot. It hardly mattered in practical terms, since Gentile was leaving for the States anyway. But the symbolism is almost unbearable. The finest fighter of the war, in the hands of one of the finest pilots of the war, destroyed not by an enemy, but by the same appetite for the camera that had made him famous. Shangri-La, the airplane whose name had appeared in 100 newspaper stories, wrecked at the edge of the field, some say bulldozed into a pond, because its pilot had performed for the press one time too many. I think there is no cleaner illustration in the whole air war of what the publicity machine does to the men it lifts up. It teaches them that the performance is the point, and then the performance kills the airplane. Gentile went home to America a hero. The Bond tour was its own kind of theater, and it is worth seeing clearly because it is the machine doing openly what it usually did in the shadows. The Army Air Forces brought its 2 young aces home and sent them around the country to be looked at, to stand on stages and shake hands and let ordinary Americans buy a piece of the war by buying a piece of them. The message the publicity men wanted was teamwork, the 2 flyers who fought as one, and there is a real irony in that because the same apparatus that was selling their partnership on stage had spent the previous months building only one of them into a star. On the platform, they were a duo. On the front page, there had only ever been one name in the largest type. Gentile, by the accounts we have, was never entirely comfortable in the role. He was a fighter pilot, not a performer, and the war he understood was up in the freezing air over Germany, not down on a stage in a well-pressed uniform. But the machine had decided what he was for now, and there is no arguing with the machine once it has chosen you. He sold the bonds. He shook the hands. He never flew another combat mission. And John Godfrey, the wingman, went home with him for the Bond tour, and then did something that tells you exactly who he was. He went back. While Gentile stayed in the States and let his war end in ceremony, Godfrey talked his way into a second combat tour and returned to Debden in the summer of 1944. And here, the parallel lines of these 2 lives, which had run so close together, finally split for good. One man safe and celebrated at home, the other back over Germany, still writing his letters to Reggie in the only language he had. Godfrey's second tour was ferocious. On the 5th of August, 1944, he destroyed a Messerschmitt 109 in the air and 3 Junkers 52 transports on the ground, and with a squadron mate, shot up 8 locomotives for good measure. The next day, the 6th of August, he got a Messerschmitt 410, and it would prove to be his last aerial victory. That same day, he nursed a crippled Mustang home across occupied Europe for more than 2 hours after its coolant system was hit, flying with the canopy open, working the fuel primer by hand on the advice of a squadron mate over the radio to keep the engine alive, and he brought it back, his hand raw and bleeding from the effort. That is the man the country never made a poster of, the one who flew a dying airplane home by hand rather than bail out and lose it. And then came the 24th of August, 1944, and the cruelest irony in a story already full of them. Godfrey led a section down to strafe a German airfield near Nordhausen. Strafing was the deadliest work a fighter pilot did, far more dangerous than air-to-air combat because it meant flying low and straight and predictable through a storm of ground fire again and again to burn parked aircraft. Godfrey made pass after pass and destroyed 4 more Junkers 52s on the ground. And on one of those passes, his Mustang was hit, and he was forced down behind enemy lines, and he became a prisoner of war. Here's where I have to be careful, because the audience deserves the disputed truth and not the tidy legend. There are 2 accounts of how John Godfrey was brought down that day, and I'm going to give you both. The first, and the better documented, is devastating. According to the 4th Fighter Group's own records, and confirmed by the official history of that airframe's fate, Godfrey learned only after the war, watching the gun camera film back at Debden, that he had not been hit by the Germans at all. He had been hit by his own wingman, who had pressed in too close during the strafing runs and put his fire into Godfrey's aircraft. The second account holds that it was German ground fire that got him, the flak that any pilot flying low over an enemy field was inviting. Both are possible. Low strafing exposed you to both dangers at once, but the weight of the evidence, the gun camera film, and the surviving records points to the first, and it is almost too bitter to say out loud. The greatest protective wingman of the American Air War, the man whose entire craft was guarding the tail of the pilot beside him so that pilot could survive, was himself shot down by the guns of the man flying on his wing. The wingman, undone by a wingman. If a novelist wrote that, you would put the book down and call it too neat. But the records say it happened, and the men of the 4th Fighter Group who did not deal in sentiment recorded it as the fact it was, and noted that the irony was not lost on Godfrey himself. He survived, and his time as a prisoner was its own ordeal, and it deserves more than a sentence. He was sent to Stalag Luft III, the camp for captured Allied airmen, the same camp that had staged the mass tunnel escape earlier that year. Godfrey was not a man built for captivity. Twice he tried to get out and was caught and thrown back. And then, in the bitter winter that closed the war, as the Soviet armies pressed in from the east, the Germans marched their prisoners out of the camp and westward on foot through the snow, a brutal forced march that killed some of the weaker men outright. It was in the chaos of that collapse on his 3rd attempt that Godfrey finally got away and made it through the disintegrating front to the American lines. Think about the shape of his war for a moment. He had come north as a boy to avenge a drowned brother. He had flown into the worst air fighting of the war and matched the best pilots in it. He had been shot down, most likely by one of his own, taken prisoner, marched through a killing winter, and had walked out the far side under his own power in the last days. And through all of it, he had never once been the face on the poster, never been the one the cameras waited for, never been called a one-man air force by a general in front of the newsreels. He had simply done the work, all of it, the whole terrible length of it, and survived. He came home, but the sky was finished with him, and in a way the country never quite noticed he had been there. Let me put the 2 aircraft side by side for a moment, because for this audience, the machines are part of the men, and getting them right is how you honor both. Gentile's Mustang was a P-51B, a Razorback, carrying the squadron code letters VF and the individual letter T. He named it Shangri-La, and its flanks were painted with a red and white checkerboard along the exhausts, and a scoreboard of little crosses marking his kills. Godfrey's definitive Mustang was also a P-51B, a Razorback, code VFP, and he called it Reggie's Reply, marked with a matching red and white check and his own row of victory crosses, and on an earlier aircraft, the image of his dog inside a horseshoe. When Godfrey was finally shot down, though, he was not flying his own named aircraft. He was in a different Mustang, a P-51D, that happened to be the one available that day. The airplane that bore his brother's memory outlasted him in service. The one he was captured in was a borrowed machine, and since this audience will want the machine described properly, let me do it. The P-51B that these men flew was the airplane that changed everything, and it did so because someone had the sense to take the American airframe and put a British engine in it, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, built under license in America by Packard as the V1650. That engine gave the Mustang a top speed around 440 miles an hour, and more importantly, a reach no other fighter could match. But the early B model was not perfect, and the men who flew it knew its faults intimately. It carried only 4 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 2 in each wing, and those guns were mounted at an angle, canted over to fit the thin wing, and in a hard-turning fight, When the pilot pulled heavy G, the ammunition belts could jam and the guns fall silent at the worst possible moment. Imagine finally getting a 109 in your sights after a 2-minute turning fight and squeezing the trigger and hearing nothing. That happened, and it cost pilots kills and very nearly cost some of them their lives. The visibility from the Razorback canopy was also poor to the rear, the very direction a fighter pilot most needs to see, which is one more reason the wingman watching behind you was not a luxury but a necessity. Some of these B models were later fitted with a bulged British canopy called the Malcolm hood to help with the view. The later P-51D would fix most of this. 6 guns mounted upright and fed properly. A bubble canopy a man could see out of in every direction. But Gentile and Godfrey won their fame in the flawed, magnificent bird-caged B, jammed guns and blind spots and all, and that is the airplane that belongs in every frame of their best day. And one more detail for the people who will freeze the frame. In March and April of 1944, these Mustangs wore the national star and bar with the blue surround, not the red-bordered insignia that had been used only briefly in the summer of 1943 and was gone by that autumn. And they did not yet wear the black and white invasion stripes which were not painted on until the eve of the Normandy landings in June. If you see red-bordered stars or invasion stripes on a Mustang in Gentile's Great Berlin fight, the picture is wrong by a matter of months. This is the kind of thing this audience catches in a heartbeat, and they are right too. So what happened to the two of them after the war took their flying away? Don Gentile stayed in the Air Force. He became a test pilot, he married, he studied, he settled into the peacetime service that had once turned him away for lack of a college degree. And on the 28th of January, 1951, flying a T-33 jet trainer near Forestville, Maryland, not far from Andrews Field, his engine failed. He was too low to restart it, and in trying to put the aircraft down, he struck trees and was killed. He was 30 years old. A passenger died with him. The leading American ace in Europe, the one-man Air Force, survived the whole ferocious weight of the Luftwaffe over Berlin and died in a training accident in the Maryland woods in peacetime 5 years after the war he had conquered. John Godfrey came home to Rhode Island, married, took over a family lace manufacturing business, and went into politics, winning a seat in the Rhode Island State Senate in 1952. He built a life, and then, in the mid-1950s, his body began to fail him in a way no wingman could cover. He was diagnosed with a disease Americans call Lou Gehrig's disease, the slow, total paralysis that leaves the mind intact inside a body that will no longer answer it. Knowing what was coming, Godfrey dictated his memoir, a book called The Look of Eagles, one of the finest first-person accounts any fighter pilot has left us, unsparing about the fear and the killing and the cost. He died on the 12th of June, 1958, at his home in Maine at the age of 36. To his last months, Godfrey was still fighting a quiet battle with the Air Force over his record, insisting the numbers had never been counted right, that his real total was higher than the official books allowed. It is a small, sad detail, and I find it the most human thing in the whole story. The forgotten wingman, dying by inches, still trying to make the record show that he had been there, that he had done the work, that the man on the poster had not flown alone. Let me tell you what I think this contrast reveals, because it is bigger than two pilots. The mythology of the fighter ace is the mythology of the individual. One man, one machine, one score, the lone knight of the air. It is a beautiful story, and the country has always loved it. And the machine that ran the air war loved it most of all, because a single heroic face sells bonds and fills recruiting offices in a way that a diagram of a four-ship formation never will. So the machine went looking for faces. And when it found two equally gifted young men who happened to fly together, it did not celebrate the partnership. It could not. A partnership is not a poster. It chose one, the quotable one, the one whose radio chatter made good newspaper copy, and it built him up, padded his score with ground kills until he had beaten a First World War legend, staged his medal ceremony twice for the cameras, and shipped him home a star. The other one it left in the cockpit. And the deepest irony, the one I keep coming back to, is that the whole thing was built on a lie about how fighters actually win. Fighters do not win as individuals. They win in pairs, leader and wingman, one striking and one guarding, and the ace's glittering personal score is very often a monument built on the vigilance of the anonymous man off his wingtip. Gentile's own greatest day was a shared day. Godfrey guarded the tail that let the record grow. The system celebrated the individual while depending, every single mission, on the team it refused to name. It took the truest fact of air combat, that no one survives alone, and it printed the opposite on the front page. In my view, you cannot understand the air war, or frankly a good deal of the world you have worked in, until you have sat with that. The people who understand the actual work are very often not the people the institution chooses to celebrate. The institution celebrates the ones who are legible to it, quotable, photogenic, easy to turn into a story, and it quietly runs on the ones it overlooks. Don Gentile was a great pilot who deserved his fame and was ill-served by the way it was manufactured. John Godfrey was an equally great pilot who deserved the same fame and never got it, and who spent his last strength trying to correct a record that had been written to need only one name. And notice how efficiently the machine covered its tracks. It did not have to lie outright about Godfrey. It simply had to point the light somewhere else. Nobody sat down and decided to erase John Godfrey. There was no conspiracy, no order, no villain signing a document. There was just 1,000 small choices, which pilot to quote, which face to photograph, which score to round up, which ceremony to film twice, and each of those choices flowed toward the man who was already famous, because that is the direction attention always flows. The famous get more famous, and the overlooked stay overlooked, not by malice, but by momentum. That is the quiet machinery I want you to see, because it is the same machinery that runs in every institution you have ever belonged to, and it never announces itself. It just keeps pointing the light at the name that is already lit. I do not think either man was the villain here. That is the thing this story refuses to let you have, a villain. Gentile did not steal Godfrey's glory. He flew superbly and was embarrassed by his own inflation. Godfrey did not resent Gentile. He flew home beside him and went out to sell the same bonds. The villain, if there is one, is the machine that decided a war needs heroes more than it needs the truth, and that a hero has to be one man alone. That machine is still running in every field of work you have ever been part of. It just does not usually leave 2 young men dead before 40, one in a peacetime crash, and one paralyzed in a bed in Maine, still arguing that he had been there. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this pair, and I know some of you have real connections to the 4th Fighter Group and to Debden. If your father or grandfather flew with the 4th, or worked the flight line at Debden, or served in the 336th Fighter Squadron, I would like to hear about it. Those stories matter, and they are how the record gets corrected the way John Godfrey wanted it corrected. Drop them in the comments below. Let me leave you with the image I cannot get out of my head. 2 Mustangs, alone over Berlin on the 8th of March, 1944, turning into an enemy they had no business fighting, because each one trusted the other to watch the sky he could not see. That was the truth of it. 2 men covering each other, equal in the only measure that counted up there. The country took that truth and turned it into one famous name and one forgotten one. It pinned the medal twice for the cameras. It bulldozed the airplane into the pond. It sent the star home and left the wingman to be shot down by a wingman. Don Gentile got the headlines. John Godfrey got shot down covering a man the world had already decided to remember without him. And the record still is not quite straight, which is the whole reason we sat here and went through it, number by disputed number, so that for at least the length of this story, both of them were in the photograph. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.